When I first arrived in Alaska, the sheer enormity of the wilderness took my breath away. It was nothing like the tame forests I'd hiked before. Here, the trees were taller, the air sharper, and the silence so vast it was almost deafening. Alaska's forests have this uncanny way of swallowing you whole, making you feel so small and insignificant. People say it's a magical place, and it is, but it's also undeniably unforgiving. There's a raw power here, an edge to the landscape that feels ancient and untouched. Once you step into those woods, you're out of reach, miles from any town, any help, or any trace of civilization. Out here, the rules are different. The wilderness calls to people like me, people who crave solitude and that feeling of being truly off the grid. For a lot of us, Alaska represents freedom and adventure, but also a test of self-reliance. I'd heard stories before, of course, from friends and other hikers who'd braved the forests. They spoke of intense beauty in vast open spaces, of catching glimpses of moose, bears, or eagles soaring overhead. But there was always a warning tucked into their tales, a reminder that Alaska is relentless and unforgiving. Many told me you had to respect the land and never underestimate it. They'd say the land doesn't forgive mistakes. I thought they were just talking about the natural dangers, avalanches, storms, wildlife. It never crossed my mind that people could be part of the threat. In Alaska, once you leave the main trails, it's easy to lose track of direction. The trees become thicker, the paths disappear, and even the sounds from the outside world vanish. There were times I'd find myself standing still, just to listen to the silence. It wasn't like silence back home. This was a silence that pressed against you, as if the land itself was watching. After a while, though, that silence can become unsettling. I started to realize that in a place like this, you can never be sure if you're truly alone. Then I started hearing about strange encounters, stories that didn't just involve nature's dangers, but something more sinister. I met one hiker who looked like he hadn't slept in days, eyes sunken and haunted. He told me he'd been hiking near Denali when he saw a figure up ahead, just standing there, motionless in the trees. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. He thought it was another hiker, but as he got closer, he saw this man's clothes were tattered, his face obscured by a wild, unkempt beard. The stranger just watched him, never saying a word. When he tried to pass, the man followed him, keeping his distance but never breaking eye contact. It was like he wanted me to know he was there, he said, shuddering at the memory. I couldn't shake him. Every time I stopped, he'd stop. When I moved, he moved. It was as if he was waiting for something. At first, I dismissed these stories as exaggerations. Maybe they'd just run into a random person, someone a little odd or a lost hiker. But the more I listened, the more I realized these encounters weren't just about one isolated incident. They were happening in different parts of Alaska, with different hikers, all describing that same chilling experience. Strangers appearing out of nowhere, watching from a distance, following silently. Some hikers even described hearing footsteps echoing their own, just far enough behind to avoid being seen, but close enough to feel like someone was right there, always watching. One night around a campfire, I heard one of the most disturbing stories yet. This one came from a seasoned hiker, a guy who'd spent years exploring Alaska and wasn't easily scared. He told me about a trip he'd taken up north where he encountered a small group of men who seemed out of place. They didn't speak, didn't respond when he greeted them, just stared with this blank intensity. He said they looked worn down, like they'd been out there far longer than they should have. At first, he thought maybe they were survivalists, people who'd chosen to live off the grid. But there was something unsettling in their eyes, something feral. When he decided to move on, they followed him. Not close enough to confront him, but just far enough behind to make him feel like he was being hunted. In those moments, the solitude and isolation that had once felt freeing turned into something menacing. He said it was like the forest had swallowed them, these strangers, as if they were part of the land itself. As he told his story, I noticed the way his hands shook slightly, the way he glanced over his shoulder, even here, safe by the fire. The encounter had left a mark on him, a lingering fear that made him question everything he thought he knew about these woods. There's something primal in the fear of being watched, something that taps into an ancient instinct, a warning from deep within. You feel it in your gut, a cold twist of unease, like the air is charged with something you can't see but can definitely feel. In Alaska's forests, that feeling never really leaves you. It's as if the trees are holding secrets, dark and ancient. And sometimes, just sometimes, those secrets step out from the shadows. And when they do, they look at you with hollow eyes as if you're the intruder, the one who doesn't belong. As I kept hearing these stories, a thought crept into my mind. Who were these people? What were they doing out there, so far from civilization? Were they hiding from something, or perhaps hiding something themselves? I began to wonder if the isolation of Alaska had changed them, twisted them somehow, as if the endless solitude had stripped away whatever connection they once had to the outside world and left behind something else entirely. Or maybe they were just people who had slipped through the cracks, vanished into the woods to escape something we'd never know. Whatever the reason, it's clear that in these forests, you're not always alone. There are others out there, watching, waiting, and you never really know what they're waiting for. The first time I realized someone was following me in the Alaskan wilderness, it didn't hit me as fear right away. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. The trail was narrow and winding, with dense trees on both sides that made it feel more like a tunnel than a path. I was hours away from the last campsite, miles into a section of forest that was barely marked on any map. Out there, every little sound stands out, the snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves. I'd been hearing noises behind me for a while, little things I tried to dismiss. I told myself it was probably just animals, maybe a fox or a hare darting through the brush. But as I moved, so did the sound. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath to listen. And there it was, a faint crunch in the distance but deliberate. I waited, holding my breath. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard it again, closer this time. I didn't see anyone, but I felt that cold wave of realization wash over me. Something or someone was mirroring my movements. I felt my heartbeat quicken, but I told myself to stay calm. Turning around, I couldn't see anyone through the thick trees, but that feeling of being watched was undeniable. It was as if someone was just beyond my line of sight, lurking in the shadows. As I kept moving, I became hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the forest around me. It felt as if the whole landscape was watching, holding its breath. The sense of being followed didn't fade. It only intensified. I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a dark figure ducking behind trees, never fully in view. Every time I'd turn, they'd be gone, just a shadow retreating into the woods. It was maddening, like a game of cat and mouse, except I didn't know if I was the cat or the mouse. I quickened my pace, but the faster I moved, the closer they seemed to get, as if they were waiting for me to break, to run. I remember reaching a clearing and thinking that maybe, just maybe, they'd stop if I confronted them. I turned around and called out, my voice echoing into the silence. "Who's there?" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. There was no response, just the oppressive quiet of the forest. I waited, straining to hear any movement, any answer. But instead of a response, I felt an intense, almost overwhelming presence, like someone was standing right behind me. My skin prickled, every nerve on edge. I wanted to turn, to look, but my instincts screamed at me to keep moving. I don't know how long I stayed in that clearing, but it felt like hours, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Eventually, I forced myself to keep going. I thought that maybe, if I walked fast enough, whoever was following would lose interest, that they'd leave me alone. But as I continued, I realized they were still there. I could hear them closer than ever, footsteps crunching just out of sight. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I'd see a dark shape slipping behind a tree as if it was teasing me, taunting me. The sun was setting by this point, casting long shadows across the trail. The dim light made it even harder to see, and every shadow felt like it was alive, shifting and moving in unnatural ways. I felt a surge of panic as darkness settled over the forest. I had no idea who or what was out there with me, only that they didn't seem to want me to leave. My mind raced with thoughts, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they were locals who didn't want outsiders on their land, or survivalists who'd taken to scaring people off. But deep down, I felt it was something darker, something twisted. I remember another story I'd heard, one that seemed absurd at the time, but now felt terrifyingly real. A hiker had described a similar encounter, where he'd been stalked for hours by someone he couldn't quite see. He said that he'd turned around at one point and come face to face with his pursuer, a man with wild, unblinking eyes and a face smeared with something dark, almost like mud or blood. The man didn't speak, didn't react, just stared with a strange, unsettling intensity. When he tried to get away, the man had followed him for miles, pacing him step for step, never saying a word. The hiker had finally lost him by taking a sudden, steep detour off the trail, cutting through dense underbrush to escape. He looked at me like I was prey, the hiker had said, his voice barely above a whisper. I had laughed it off then, but now, that memory sent a chill through me. What if it wasn't just a story? I kept walking, my eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. Suddenly I saw him. A figure standing dead still, partially hidden by the branches but close enough that I could make out the outline. He was just standing there, watching me. His clothes were tattered, his posture hunched, as if he'd been out there for a long time. He didn't call out or make any move to hide, just stared at me with a strange, unsettling focus. I wanted to shout, to tell him to leave me alone, but the words caught in my throat. Every instinct told me to keep my distance, to move, but my feet felt frozen. I don't know how long we stood there watching each other. Then, slowly, he took a step forward, and something in me snapped. I turned and bolted down the trail, not caring if he was following. I didn't dare look back, too afraid of what I might see. I could hear him moving behind me, faster now, matching my pace. My legs burned as I pushed myself to run harder, my lungs aching from the cold air, but I couldn't stop. My only thought was to get away, to put as much distance between us as possible. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I risked a glance back and saw him again, closer this time, his face partially illuminated by the fading light. There was something in his eyes, something wild, unhinged, like he was enjoying this chase. It wasn't just a game to him, it was something more, something predatory. I felt my stomach twist in fear. This wasn't just a random encounter, this was deliberate. He wanted me to know he was there, that he was watching, hunting. In that moment I realized I wasn't just a hiker in Alaska's wilderness anymore. I was prey. And this man, whoever he was determined to follow me, to stay just out of reach but close enough to keep me running. There was no reason to his actions, no logic, only an endless pursuit that felt like it would never end. By the time I finally reached the edge of the trail, where I could see the faint outline of a ranger station in the distance, I felt like I had aged years. I didn't stop running until I reached safety, and even then I could still feel his presence lingering in my mind, that haunting memory of his eyes following me. To this day, I don't know who he was, or why he chose to follow me. But every time I think of Alaska, of those dark, silent forests, I remember the feeling of being hunted. And I know that somewhere out there, in the depths of those endless woods, he's still waiting, ready to follow anyone else who dares to cross his path. I don't think I'll ever forget that night, the one where I barely made it out. It's strange how survival instincts kick in, how your body seems to know things that your mind can barely comprehend. I was miles deep in the wilderness when it happened. I'd been hiking for days, feeling that familiar mix of awe and unease that Alaska's forests always gave me. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind or the distant call of some unseen bird. But that night the forest felt different, charged, almost tense, as if it was holding its breath. I had just set up camp near a small clearing, surrounded by trees that loomed over me like silent sentries. As darkness settled in, I made myself a quick dinner, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. It wasn't unusual to feel a bit spooked out there. After all, I was alone, and isolation has a way of making the mind race. But this was different. It was like the air had shifted, thickened. I felt watched, as if there were eyes on me from somewhere beyond the firelight, eyes I couldn't see but could sense. I remember turning in for the night, forcing myself to ignore that nagging feeling and convincing myself that I was just tired. I lay there, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside, the crackling of the fire, the occasional snap of a twig. It was sometime after midnight when I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the underbrush around my camp. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, paralyzed, listening as the footsteps came closer, pausing every few steps as if whoever was out there was listening too, waiting to see if I'd make a sound. I barely breathed, lying as still as I could. The footsteps circled my camp, slow and heavy, almost cautious. My mind raced with thoughts, trying to figure out who or what could be out there. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself, trying to calm down. But the footsteps were too measured, too intentional. This was no bear or moose. It was someone, and they were taking their time, moving in a slow, almost predatory rhythm. I felt my skin prickle with fear, every nerve on high alert. At one point, the footsteps stopped, just a few feet from my tent. I could feel the weight of their presence, a silent pressure that pressed against me, daring me to move. My hand instinctively reached for the small knife I kept by my sleeping bag, my fingers tightening around the handle. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything that would break the suffocating silence, but I was frozen, locked in a tense standoff with whoever, or whatever, was outside. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally, I heard the footsteps retreat, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, knife in hand, straining to hear any sound that might tell me they were coming back. By the time the first light of dawn crept into the sky, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed and my mind racing with questions. Who were they? Why had they been there, circling my camp in the dead of night? Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then, but another part, the part that had come here seeking adventure, convinced me to stay, to push on and see this trip through. The next day I tried to shake off the experience, telling myself it was just a fluke, that maybe it had been some curious local, or a lost hiker. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The encounter had left a mark on me, a lingering sense of dread that followed me as I continued my hike. I tried to keep my mind focused, to keep moving forward, but every so often I'd catch glimpses of movement in the trees, shadows that seemed to dart away the moment I looked. That night I set up camp early, trying to find a spot that felt safe, though I knew deep down that no place in these woods would ever feel truly safe again. As darkness fell, I sat by my fire, my eyes scanning the forest, my senses on high alert. I don't know how long I sat there staring into the trees, but at some point I heard it again. The faint rustle of footsteps moving through the underbrush coming closer. This time I didn't freeze, I couldn't afford to. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining it into the trees, my heart pounding as I searched for any sign of who was out there. I caught a glimpse of him, a figure half hidden by the shadows, his face obscured but his eyes glinting in the firelight. He was watching me, standing just on the edge of the clearing, his posture tense like he was waiting for something. I called out, my voice shaking but firm, demanding that he leave, that he back off. He didn't move, just stood there staring at me with that same unsettling intensity. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew that if I showed fear, it would only make things worse. I kept my flashlight trained on him, refusing to look away. Eventually, he took a step back, then another, fading into the darkness, his eyes never leaving mine. I stayed up all night again, sitting by the fire with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. Not that night. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, my body aching from the tension and lack of sleep. I knew I had to make a choice, keep going or turn back. Part of me wanted to push on, to prove that I wasn't afraid, but another part, the part that valued my life, knew it was time to leave. I packed up my gear and started back down the trail, my eyes scanning the forest, every rustle and shadow putting me on edge. As I made my way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me, lurking in the shadows. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding as I put as much distance as I could between myself and that camp. Every so often I'd hear a faint sound behind me, a snap of a twig, a rustle of leaves, and I'd quicken my step, too afraid to look back. I knew he was there, somewhere, watching, waiting, just out of sight. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, the first glimpse of civilization felt like a lifeline, a relief so profound that I almost fell to my knees. But even as I stepped back into safety, I felt that lingering sense of dread, that feeling of being watched, of being hunted. I couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, the way he had stood there, silent and unmoving, like he belonged to the forest itself, like he was part of something darker, something ancient and predatory. To this day, I still feel that presence when I think back to those nights in Alaska. I see his eyes in my nightmares, feel his footsteps echoing in my mind. People ask me why I left so suddenly, why I cut my trip short, and I tell them it was the cold or the rough terrain. But the truth is, I was running from something I still don't fully understand, something that haunts me every time I close my eyes. In the end, it wasn't the wilderness that broke me. It was him, that silent figure in the shadows, the one who didn't need to speak, who didn't need to chase. He knew I'd run, that I'd flee from those endless woods, and he was right. I left Alaska with a part of myself lost to those dark forests, a part that still wonders what would have happened if I hadn't run, if I'd stayed and faced whatever he was, whatever he wanted. But some things are better left unanswered, and some places, I've learned, are better left untouched. After making it out of the forest, I couldn't shake the experience. Days turned into weeks, but every night when I closed my eyes, I was back there in the woods, hearing the crunch of footsteps, feeling that cold stare from the shadows. I tried to go back to my normal life, but Alaska's wilderness had left its mark, a weight that seemed to cling to me wherever I went. People would ask about the trip, eager to hear about my time in Alaska, and I'd feel that same dread well up inside. How could I explain it? I'd barely been able to make sense of it myself. One night, after tossing and turning for hours, I finally sat down and started searching online, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain what happened out there. I looked up stories of hikers encountering strange people in remote areas, tales of isolation taking its toll on people living off the grid. Alaska, I learned, had its fair share of strange, unexplainable encounters. As I delved deeper, I found story after story of hikers and campers who'd experienced things eerily similar to mine. They described shadowy figures watching from the trees, people who seemed out of place, disheveled, and eerily silent. It was as if these encounters were part of a hidden layer of the wilderness that few dared to acknowledge. The theories ranged from plausible to downright strange. Some people thought these figures were survivalists, men and women who'd rejected society and lived off the grid in the remotest parts of Alaska, determined to keep to themselves and defend their solitude at all costs. Others believed they might be criminals, people hiding out in the woods, evading the law, and scaring off anyone who might accidentally stumble into their territory. But there was something about those explanations that didn't sit right with me. What I encountered didn't feel like a mere survivalist or a hermit. There was a malevolence to it, a sense of deliberate intent that went beyond someone just wanting to be left alone. Then I found stories about the Alaskan Bushmen. According to some locals, there were people, maybe even entire groups, who had vanished into Alaska's wilderness decades ago, never to return to society. Some said these people were descendants of early settlers or indigenous communities who had cut themselves off from the world. The stories described them as almost ghostly figures, people who had adapted to the forest so well that they moved through it like shadows, appearing and disappearing at will. Some said these bushmen had lost touch with civilization so completely that they'd become more animal than human, predators in their own right, with no allegiance to anyone but the forest. I shivered reading these tales, feeling a chill that brought me right back to those dark woods. But there were stranger theories too, ones that felt even more unsettling. Some people believed that certain areas of the Alaskan wilderness were cursed or haunted by spirits, forces that protected the land and drove away intruders. The locals spoke in hushed voices about how Alaska has always had its secrets, and how some places were not meant for people. They told stories of ancient entities that watched over the land, spirits that could take on human forms, testing those who wandered too far into forbidden places. There was even a term I came across: the forest people. According to legend, they were shapeshifters, beings that could blend into the landscape, appearing as people one moment and disappearing into the shadows the next. I didn't know if I believed in spirits or curses, but there was something about these stories that felt familiar, something that echoed what I'd experienced. I could still feel his eyes on me, that intense stare that felt more animal than human, like I was nothing more than prey. Part of me wondered if I'd come too close to one of these forbidden places, if maybe I'd seen something I wasn't meant to see. It was as if Alaska itself had sent this figure to warn me, to push me out, reminding me that there are places where we don't belong. I started reaching out to other hikers, people I'd met over the years, and asked if they'd ever had similar experiences. Most of them looked at me like I was crazy, laughing off my questions or dismissing it as paranoia, but there were a few, just a few, who knew exactly what I was talking about. One man, a veteran hiker with more than 30 years of experience, told me about an encounter he'd had in a remote valley. He'd seen a group of people standing at the edge of the tree line, their faces painted with what looked like ash or mud, watching him in complete silence. He said their eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion, like they weren't really human. When he'd tried to speak to them, they'd just turned and melted into the forest without a sound. It was like they were part of the forest, he told me, his voice trembling. Like they were the forest. Another woman I spoke to had heard tales from her grandparents who were indigenous to Alaska. They warned of the Watchers, beings who guarded the deep woods and took vengeance on anyone who came too close. She said her grandparents believed these beings were spirits of the land, protectors who took on human forms to scare off those who didn't belong. When I asked her if she believed these stories, she just shrugged, saying, "I don't know if it's true, but I know the forest has its rules. Sometimes it lets us in, and sometimes it doesn't." Even as I spoke to these people, I knew I'd never find a clear answer. Alaska's wilderness is too vast, too ancient, to ever be fully understood. There are secrets out there, layers upon layers of mystery that have been there long before we came, and will remain long after we're gone. I realize that maybe some things aren't meant to be explained, that maybe there's a kind of wisdom in leaving certain questions unanswered. The forest has its own way of keeping people out, of protecting itself, and those who go too deep are rarely the same when they come back, if they come back at all. In the end, I left Alaska with more questions than answers. I know now that there are places in this world that aren't meant for us, places that guard their mysteries with a ferocity we can't begin to understand. The man who followed me, who watched me from the shadows, whether he was real, whether he was a spirit or a lost soul or something else entirely, I'll never know. But I know that I was meant to leave, to turn my back on that forest and never return. Sometimes late at night I can still feel that presence, that sense of being watched. I'll hear a sound in the distance, a faint echo of footsteps, and my heart will race, my mind flashing back to those endless woods. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination, just a memory clinging on. But a part of me wonders if the forest isn't done with me yet. If maybe, just maybe, it's still watching, waiting. As much as I want answers, as much as I want to know what really happened out there, I realize now that some mysteries are best left alone. There are places in this world that are bigger, older, and darker than we can ever understand. And Alaska's wilderness, wild, ancient, and untamed, will always be one of those places. It guards its secrets well, keeping them hidden among the trees and shadows, waiting for the next traveler who dares to venture too deep.